Enough conversation and breaks, and here's the trick, guys. If we get done a little early with the material, I'll let you go a little early. We're going to finish chapter 4 today, hell or high water, but if we wrap up quickly, we'll wrap up quickly. Just a reminder, I'm not going to cover this assignment today because we're going to keep some time up, but I'm asking you to do this. I forgot to change the due date. The due date is now 10/25, so this assignment is going to be due the Friday you get back from break, not the Wednesday. So remember that, guys. I'll cover it again on that Wednesday when you get back, because call me a betting man, but I'm betting not a lot of people are working on homework over the next 6 days if they can avoid it. I don't blame you. So we'll talk about it on Wednesday when we get back. Now, we left off talking a little bit about the Landrum-Griffin Act. Guys, what I want you to take away from this slide before we return to our video about Jimmy Hoffa is the fact we had a lot of unions in the 50s and early 60s who were heavily involved in organized crime. The Teamsters were one of those unions that really was kind of notorious for this, guys. When we start talking about the Teamsters, we're talking about cross-state commerce. We're talking about people who are in really good positions to move illicit goods and to take bribes and to sometimes enforce muscle. Guys, the Teamsters had a reputation that if you had non-union truckers coming in and out of your companies, they occasionally would show up with crowbars and with a lot of muscle to make sure people knew that this was going to be a union part of town. That kind of perception, by the way, was highly associated. When I say this, guys, I do not mean it as an offensive statement, but a lot of these were associated with certain ethnic groups, for example, Italians and Irish, because they have strong affiliations with organized crime. We talk about the mafia and the Irish mob and that sort of stuff. I don't mean it as a judgmental statement. I mean it to say that that's why there were some very negative connotations of unions in the Deep South. The Deep South also happens to be more dominated by a certain religious faith. What is it? As opposed to the Northeast. What is it? It's more Protestant, and in particular, we do not see a lot of Catholics in the Deep South. And a lot of those groups were associated with Irish, Italian, and other kinds of Eastern European immigrants as well. And there was a lot of, when we talk about racism in this country, there was a lot of racism even within Caucasian groups because of things like a religious affiliation. And a lot of that was based on ethnicity, and a lot of that ethnicity was associated sometimes with organized crime. I don't say that to set judgment. It is history. It's something we have to learn from and know why things happen the way they did. So the Landrum-Griffin Act came out and basically said if you're running a union, you have to disclose where you're spending the money. You have to disclose how your organization is set up. You have to disclose how people in your company, your union rather, are getting paid for their duties to make sure they're not getting kickbacks, that they are not getting paid for inappropriate lobbying, they're not getting paid to muscle people. Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most famous people in this group. So we're going to continue our video about Jimmy Hoffa just to show you how powerful this guy was before. It tells us a lot about the way that the American labor system was set up at the time. So let's think about this, the 1950s. We have the 1950s, and Jimmy Hoffa was in charge of one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Still a very powerful union to this day. In fact, we talked in the last class, why are the Teamsters so powerful now in 2019? Why could they be a potentially powerful union? Yes?
Because they kind of run the behind-the-scenes stuff with e-commerce.
We have so many folks, and that's exactly right, we have so many folks who are relying on shipping these days to get products from one place to another. We buy so little that's actually local that we rely on shipping for just about everything. So we're talking about a union that potentially could control that kind of distribution. The 50s really weren't much different. Jimmy Hoffa himself, though, had consolidated a lot of power as one person. So you have Hoffa, who is a very powerful and ostensibly corrupt person. So this is a guy who was getting kickbacks, who was taking more than his fair share, and was probably involved in things such as racketeering, price fixing, and all kinds of terrible things. Ultimately, he gets taken down. He gets sent to jail. While he's in jail, of course, we have a couple other things that are happening. The 1960s, the assassination of JFK. Jimmy Hoffa's people, the Teamsters and some parts of the mob, have occasionally been associating conspiracy theories with the assassination of JFK. I can neither confirm nor deny that. I think sometimes people are stretching for stuff. But I do think it's interesting that Richard Nixon commuted his sentence. What political party was Richard Nixon? He was a Republican. Okay, so we have Republicans and we have Democrats. Typically speaking, who is the party of unions? Typically speaking. And that's not universal either, especially today where things are getting more nuanced all the time. So why would a Republican president choose to commute the sentence of somebody who was a strong union organizer? Why would a Republican president choose to do that? Yes?
Did you say that the Teamsters that made a large donation?
That certainly doesn't hurt. But when we think about the Democrats being the party of unions, who are the Republicans typically the party of? People who own what? Companies. Typically speaking, and again, this is not a judgmental statement, it's just a statement of the way things usually wash out. Somebody who is a Republican is more likely to be somebody who owned a business or started a business who is relying on things like shipping too. I can't help but wonder if Nixon was also seeing this as a pragmatic move to make sure business continued smoothly. It's pretty interesting, though, that there may have been elements within the Teamsters, for example, who felt that Hoffa's potential return in the early 80s, when he'd be eligible to be involved in unions again based on his legal status, may have had him killed because they were afraid of him consolidating power again. Did they kill him? I don't know. I mean, depending what conspiracy theory show that you watch or what movie you watch, they all have different theories and outcomes. I'm pretty sure that he did not disappear on his own behalf. This is a guy who was taken out. Any questions or comments? Sir?
So I know you don't know, but in your opinion, do you think that had anything to do with the JFK assassination?
That's a really good question. I think that there are so many conspiracy theories about that. I honestly don't think that Jimmy Hoffa probably had much to do with it, if anything. My opinion is, I think in the JFK assassination, that it was probably people within our own government that had Kennedy killed, because I think that they felt he was doing too much saber rattling when it came down to the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. What do you think, man? Who do you think is responsible for that?
I feel like he probably wanted him dead, but I don't think he had that power.
Yeah. And I think, too, when you think about the time we were in, guys, who here knows what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about? I know we've talked about it a little bit. Anybody know what that was about? In the early 1960s, when Cuba became communist, their allies, the Russians, started moving nuclear missiles into Cuba. And those were within 50 miles of the United States. It would have been very easy for a Third World War to have been very lopsided against the United States because we had literally nuclear missiles within driving distance of coastal shores. And there was a showdown between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of Russia. And basically what it came down to was 12 hours of almost going to World War III. And there were some people who felt that JFK pushed too far, and he was the reason we almost went to World War III. And there are a lot of people who believe that elements in our own government had him assassinated because they felt he was the threat. That's one conspiracy theory. So, any other questions or comments? Yeah, this stuff's interesting. The history of our country is definitely filled with things that we sometimes ascribe to history that have happened within lifetimes of people that you know. Guys, when a union is bargaining, we try to go for what we refer to as security provisions. It means when you're setting up your contract, your collective bargaining agreement, we talked about work rules. Work rules are conditions of work. Security provisions are things that are going to help our rank and file in ways that maybe aren't directly related to the job, but more how we maintain our employment. Things like job security, for example. So, for example, if you are saying, let's say everybody here, we just were starting to organize a union. And I said to you guys, if you join my union, because I'm your organizer, I will work with our company to make sure that all new hires get $7.85 an hour compared to the $7.50 they're currently making. If you join my union, we're going to make it more difficult for you to lose your jobs. We're going to make it easier for you to maintain your employment. We're going to get you better benefits, all these things. You're going to think that's a pretty good idea, right? Job security is a big deal. So when you do security provisions, we basically try to make sure more people join the union. If we have more people joining the union, what's the union collecting more of? Dues. They're making more money and they're making themselves more capable. It also builds unity. If we say basically that we're going to install a grievance process as part of our collective bargaining agreement, it means we have a process to go through when we have problems with our employer. It means it's going to be harder for people to fire you. And it also builds the overall strength of the union. Now, when you certify a union, this is a two-step process. You vote. Once the votes are counted and you say, hey, we've chosen to organize, the National Labor Relations Board will certify your union. That's now your collective bargaining group. So if you guys all voted for a union and the National Labor Relations Board came in, you no longer can negotiate directly with your employer. You're going to be negotiating as part of your collective bargaining agreement. Here's where we get into some nuances, guys. I really want you to take careful notes during these next couple of slides because the things we're talking about are nuanced, guys. These are very minute details that affect the way unions work in specific states. This stuff also plays directly into the assignment you're going to be doing. So guys, basically we used to have something called a closed shop. A closed shop meant you had to sign up and be a member of a union before you could get a job there. That meant you had to pay dues, you had to do the paperwork, you had to be in before you could work there. By show of hands, who here thinks that's a fair arrangement to have to pay before you get into the shop? Who here thinks that's not a fair arrangement? Yeah, and the federal government agreed and basically said, okay, we're not going to allow that to be a provision. However, you can require, in certain states, this is where it gets hairy, you can require workers to become members of the union after a certain period of time. For example, if you get into a union shop, you may get what you refer to as a probationary period. So let's say, for example, for the first 30 days I'm working here, I get to learn the ropes, I get to learn how to make things, I'm part of the system in terms of manufacturing or whatever the nature of my business is. After the 30th day, I can pay dues, become a member of the union, and I can stay. If I don't become a member of the union, yes, they can get rid of me under a collective bargaining agreement if you are not in a right-to-work state. With me so far? Let's cover that again because there are some nuances here. In the current state of the law, if you are not in a right-to-work state, you can be required to join the union after a period of time to maintain your employment. Yes?
Does that period of time vary based on the state?
It can. The general window is usually 30 days, but it can vary, and it's state level.
Because I know I'm from Ohio and back home, one of the biggest employers for like high school kids or summer jobs in my area is a local grocery store, and they're actually a union shop, if you want to call it that. And so like my friend was telling me, in his first paycheck is when his union dues come out of it, and unless you want to, you have to pay or you leave.
Yeah,
there's no choice.
that is technically, even in this day and age, a closed shop or union shop. I know we kind of differentiated between those terms. If you interchange union shop and closed shop, I will never score you wrong for that because they're both equivalent terms. So here's what happens though, guys. There's also something called back rights. For example, in a union shop, you have to maintain your union membership to be a part of this organization in certain states. But there is a case that came to court called Beck versus, and we're going to be covering that in the next slide or two. The Beck rights basically said if you are a financial core member, you're going to be able to be represented. You basically pay your union dues, and the union is using them for all kinds of things. If you choose to work at a union shop, but do not want your money to be used for things like collective bargaining promotion or state level labor, that's the word I'm looking for. For state lobbying, for example, you can choose to not have your money used for certain things. So if you're a financial core member, it means you are paying for representation, you're paying for grievance, you're paying for collective bargaining. Even if you don't want to be a member of the union, you have to be a member of the union and pay dues in those shops. Now, here's where Beck comes from. It comes back from 1988, and it's the Beck objector means that you are choosing not to have your collective union dues used for anything other than collective bargaining and representation and grievance. if you do not want to have the your fees used for any of those things, you have the right to object to how your fees are spent. I know this is kind of complicated and nuanced. Here's what I want you to know about Beck rulings. What a Beck objection means is that if you do not want your dues being used for anything outside of your core contract, you can choose to not have your dues used that way. Who does this put more work onto? Any guesses? Let's say, for example, I'm collecting union dues from everybody in this room. And Jared says, I don't want to have you using these dues for state level lobbying. Ryan says, I don't want you to use these for marketing and promotion. Kenny says, well, I'm okay with all those things, but I don't want you to use them to redesign the website. And I'm the union. How does this make life more complicated for me? Any thoughts? Yes?
You have to go in for each individual to siphon the cash to each thing that they do and don't want.
It becomes an accounting nightmare. It's like when you pull into Subway with 25 people, and some people like pickles, some people don't, and some people like mayonnaise, and some people want mustard. Have you ever been in a situation where you got the wrong hoagie? Or the wrong sub, depending on what part of the country you're from, because everybody had a different preference on pickles? Yeah, it's hard to be able to administer it. So this was actually sort of a blow to unions because it made it more difficult for them to smoothly operate. Does that make sense, guys? With me so far? Clear as mud? Okay. Guys, I'm not going to read this to you, but this is an example of a union shop clause. It basically means, yes, you can be required to join a union. We also have something called an agency shop. And that means, for example, you can choose not to join the union if you are in a right-to-work state. However, you still got to pay the dues. So we can have an agency shop, for example. And we also have a contingency union shop. If you are in a right-to-work state, you cannot have a union requirement. So if you're in, for example, a state in the Deep South, they may actually say to you, you don't have to be a member of the union. But what it does come into is you can have what's referred to as a contingency plan. Here's the way it works. And I know this stuff is a little complicated, a little strange, especially on a Wednesday morning, 3 days before break. Here's the deal. If I'm in a right-to-work state, a place where I'm not required to join a union, I can put a clause in my contract, however, for folks who do want to organize, that would say, essentially, if the tide turns and this becomes a union state, if it switches from being a right to work to a union state, then yes, we have a right to create a union shop. Does that make sense? I know we're talking about a lot of nuances here, guys, and we're going to actually, if we get a chance, maybe even go through a little of the stuff that comes into the assignment with this as well. During the George W. Bush era, the 2001 era, George Bush basically said, we cannot promote unions or require people to be part of the union. He was really not all that much pro-labor in that regard. What he said is that if you're a federal government contractor, if you're doing contracts for the United States government, you've got to let your employees know their rights under the Beck case. What he's basically saying here is you have to tell your employees they have a right to know how their union dues are collected and spent. You have to publish those standards so that people know their rights. Obama, who was a very pro-union president, pulled that order back and basically said, no, you can't post this kind of stuff. You're making it too difficult for unions. And it also, for example, set a new guideline. However, if federal employees were trying to organize a union, they could not collect expenses. They could not reimburse themselves out of union dues for the process of forming a union. So even though Obama was fairly pro-labor, fairly pro-union, he did say, for example, that you can't get reimbursed when you're trying to organize. So the G.W. Bush ruling was rolled back, but Bush was definitely not pro-labor. He was definitely more pro-company. So we had a recent ruling again, and this is back in 2019, this year, March 2019. If you are a Beck objector, if you're somebody who does not want to pay your dues for specific purposes, you can also specifically request that you not have your dues used for lobbying purposes. Okay, that's a lot of nuance here, guys. So we're going to stop for a second for our first conversation and break, because that's a lot of little tiny details that we have to know. We'll somebody please ask me a question. I need to reset my brain after all that myself. Question or comment? We played Truth or Dare on my 9 a.m. class today. I'm not going to do that again. I had to do 20 push-ups. I did it, though. I did 20 push-ups. So what question would you like to ask? Don't ask me to do sit-ups, please. What question would you like to ask, guys? Yes?
You're a bus driver. Go to the first stop, you drop off 6 kids. The next stop, you drop off 4 kids. The next stop, you drop off 2 kids. What's the color of the bus driver's eyes?
Color of the bus driver's eyes? No idea.
Listen to what I said. You're a bus driver. You go to the first stop, drop off 6 kids, drop off 4 kids, drop off 2 kids. What's the color of the bus driver's eyes?
So I'm the bus driver. I see what you're saying. That's where my brain is today. I have blue eyes. Corey, you got me, man. You got me. Anybody else want to? I'm all about being made to look stupid today, too. So if you got something that makes me look dumb, abuse me for your entertainment today. What other questions would you like to ask? That was a good one. Ask me one more question. Seriously. Sir.
I have a question, but I saw a Joker a couple days ago, and I really liked it.
Has it stuck with you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about it a lot.
Yeah. Okay. How many of you have not seen the movie and want to see it yet? So we can't talk spoilers. Todd, we're not doing spoilers here. I'm just going to ask you a very veiled question. Do you think there's something to the refrigerator scene? I'm sorry?
I said that part confused.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we're not in spoiler territory because I have some theories about it. But that was like out of nowhere, was it not?
I haven't thought much of it, but now I'm going to have to look it up.
Before you look it up, think about what it might mean. Okay, good question. All right, guys, we're going to continue here in terms of federal labor laws. The feds themselves are actually fairly open to labor unions. And the feds themselves are actually one of the strongholds of labor unions. We have folks who work for many parts of the federal government that are members of organized labor, whether it's folks who work for the IRS, whether it's folks who work in different industries, even folks who work in things like sanitation and janitor services within the federal government. They're a pretty good stronghold for unions. So we have a lot of folks who are still in unions in the feds. Again, we were talking about security provisions, guys. Who here has ever heard of something called a union hall? If you haven't heard of it, guys, here's the trick. If you are not in a right-to-work state, for example, you can have union halls that will only hire union workers. And an example would be you might have a carpenter's hall or an electrician's hall where people can go and pick up contracts, and they are limited to people in the union. Now, the hall has to actually, by letter of the law, refer people who are not union members as well. But what do you think actually happens? Let's say, for example, we've got all of you guys over here who are the electricians union. And we've got a couple of folks who show up. You've got 3 jobs available. Ryan's a member of the union. Francesca's a member of the union. And who else is a member? Sarah's a member of the union. And Todd's not a member of the union. So you got 3 jobs. Who's getting the jobs, guys, over here in my union hall? The union guys. And it comes down to the idea of being, yes, we're saying it's non-discriminatory. I'm telling you in the real world, guys, sometimes people will make contracts work for people, and that's just the way it is. When you're showing all this preference to these folks who are in the union, we got our one guy, Todd, who's not in the union, who is a contractor who didn't get a job. What is that encouraging him to do? Join the union. Absolutely correct. We also have something called a preferential treatment clause that some people do get into their collective bargaining agreement. And that means, let's say, for example, we're the United Auto Workers and we work for General Motors. If we have a preferential treatment clause in our contract, that means if General Motors opens a new plant, our union members get first crack at those jobs. And then we also have something called a dues checkoff. That's also something you negotiate as a security provision, and that means that you automatically collect dues out of somebody's paycheck. Those are all things you can negotiate, generally speaking, in states that are not right-to-work states. So, in terms of some of the controversy of this stuff, there was something called Section 14B of the Labor Management Relations Act. And it said basically that there is a right for people to be able to work without having to join a labor organization before they get in. In other words, this act basically said you cannot require somebody to be a member of a union before they are employed. And in terms of whether or not you're even going to allow a closed shop, that comes down to state by state. A right-to-work state versus a non-right-to-work state. A right-to-work state means that you cannot require somebody to be a member of a union. And you cannot have a closed shop. If you have a non-right-to-work state, you can have union shops, but you cannot require people to join the union before they are hired. It comes down to the state. And we have this problem now, for example, in non-right-to-work states. We still have union environments, for example, but we have people who sometimes don't pay dues. For example, UPMC Altoona, the registered nurses in that facility are all union. Let me rephrase it. They're represented by a union. If you choose not to be a member of the union, you can choose not to pay dues. You can choose not to participate in governance, and you still enjoy the same protection because you're all covered by the same collective bargaining agreement. So we got people who don't pay any dues who are still getting higher wages, even though they don't pay into the union. Those people technically are referred to as free riders. So my question, does anybody know, is Pennsylvania a right-to-work state?
Yes.
It is not.
No.
It is not a right-to-work state. And I would, it's a good guess. We're actually going to show you a little bit of the definition of right-to-work states, and the reason I'm bringing this up, it plays into the assignment you're about to do, because the factory that you're applying to is based in Pennsylvania. So that being said, because that factory is based in Pennsylvania, can you be required after you're employed to join the union? Yes, you can, because it's not a right-to-work state. So that's the first thing. Can you choose still to determine where your dues are spent? Yes, you can. So there are complications. We're going to go through all this stuff again when we get back from break, just to make sure you're good with it. But this is all about right-to-work states. We're going to go through these regulations once again. I'll put together a little kind of a grid for you to show you how all these things work together too, because this is a little complicated. Guys, in terms of, if you look up here for a second, in terms of what we have, this list of right-to-work states, for example, you notice Pennsylvania is not on that list. And we've got non-right-to-work states. When we look at the average weekly pay, it varies greatly. For example, in Alabama, which is a right-to-work state, the average weekly paycheck is about $881. In fact, the biggest one we see on this list is right around $1,070 in Texas for a right-to-work state. If we go to non-right-to-work states, the higher wages get into places like $1,300. We have a few folks who are hitting over $1,000, $1,200. So generally speaking, non-right-to-work states, places where you can enforce union requirements on employment, typically have higher wages. Could other things be playing into this? What else might be a factor? Yes?
Things like minimum wage, because I know New York, I think it's 11 or something.
So regional wages? What else?
DC's up there, so I'm sure that living costs probably
I think you're absolutely correct. In fact, DC, I just noticed that. Thank you for pointing out. They're the highest, about $1,600. It's one of the highest cost places in the country to live. So it's not a clear-cut distinction between union and non-union, but we do see, for example, in non-right-to-work states, we do see higher wages in particular areas. It's pretty interesting to me when we think about, for example, Pennsylvania. Our wage here on average, our average take-home pay is $1,013, and compare that to a place like Utah, for example, $872, or even South Carolina. It surprised me, with that being a fairly popular tourist destination, their average take-home pay is about $817 if you divided everybody in the state's take-home pay by the number of people. That could also indicate higher population density too. There's lots of things behind this. So in terms of a map of where these right-to-work states are, what do you notice about this map, guys? Where do we see a high concentration of right-to-work states? You got it. And a lot of it is ideology. A lot of it is, if you're a car company, where do you want to set up? You want to set up in one of these dark blue states where you don't have to collect union dues or allow your members to be a member of a union. So it's pretty interesting when you think about it, though. What is the biggest state by stereotype as being a car manufacturer? Detroit is in Michigan. And Michigan is a right-to-work state. So even though Michigan is a stronghold of industry, we're not seeing as much union kind of activity maybe as we used to do. And again, in terms of the number of people, percentages who are represented by unions, of course, in terms of right-to-work states, we're going to see lower percentages of people represented by unions. In terms of percentages, it's pretty interesting to me. New York, I wasn't surprised by. That's a very strong union state. But Alaska, we've got like 23% of the population, 23% of the people who work there are represented by unions. For example, 23% of the total population and 24% of those folks are represented by unions. Pretty interesting to see that some of the more isolated states actually have higher members of union representation. And that being said, guys, we're going to get you out 5 minutes early today. Guys, before you leave, because I know we're going to have a few folks out on Friday, I'll decide if we're starting another chapter or not. What I am going to do, because we've got some very confusing regulations, I'm going to be putting together a grid for you guys. And I'll make it available for you so you can see how these different regulations line up. Use that to help you do the homework. Okay? So don't start on that assignment. It won't take you long to do. Think about it when you get back. Have a great break if I don't see you. Good luck this weekend. For those who are coming on Friday, I'll see you Friday.